Today we're going to be doing a quick mix review and tearing apart this mix from Jorge Espino. Appreciate, Jorge, you for actually giving me this mix to review. Let's dive in. This is really helpful for you and everyone else who's just watching on YouTube to figure out how to get better mixes through this process. So here we go. I'm going to play the whole song for you, and so you can hear it all the way through, and then we'll start tearing it apart.
Take me to a place where we can shine, but everywhere I go I seem to find shadows of our
very first thing is I'm going to be covering some stuff on volume balance overall. So just instrument volume balance. Very first thing, your bass guitar is too loud, especially comparatively to your kick drum. So oftentimes I like to view the kick drum and the bass guitar kind of like a seesaw. Kicks on one side, your bass guitar is on the other. Like they should be going back and forth. For example, when I was a kid, I was a really small kid in grade school. When I was 8 years old, I'd get on the seesaw, and then this other kid, Jared Mendenhall, would get on the other side, and then I would like fly up here because I was so light and small. And then I couldn't, like, no matter what I did, I could not get Jared Mendenhall to go back up on the seesaw because I was so light and he was so heavy, right? Same exact thing is happening right here. Your bass guitar is so heavy that your kick drum cannot get back down and actually poke out of the mix at all. That is the biggest thing that I am hearing. Your bass guitar needs to come down and your kick drum needs to come up. It sounds like you've done a pretty good job EQing the two to have their own spaces inside of the mix so that sonically they fit together. However, your kick drum is just not strong enough to beat out that bass guitar throughout the entire song. So overall, that is what is the defining issue in this song, is both that and then also your drums just aren't loud enough. So it's kind of like a double doozy on the low end, because you'll have your bass guitar is too loud, your drums are just too quiet in general, and then also your kick drum, again, is just even quieter than that. Overall, all of your drums need to come up. Your toms, your snare, even your hi-hat, and also your kick especially needs to all come up, and then your bass guitar needs to come down. And that'll create a lot more groove inside of the song as well, because a lot of our groove comes from our drums inside of our song. And so if your drums are getting lost inside of the mix, then your groove also gets lost. And so your bass guitar is offering some of that, but it would really be enhanced by adding some more drums as well. In the first section here too, before the vocals come in, you have this really loud guitar on the right-hand side. And so that one just really is sticking out to me. Let's listen to it really quick. So I would do one of two things. I would either turn it down or I would pan it to the center, because that'll create, it's a focus point, but it sounds too far off to the side to be a focus point. So I would either pan it towards the middle or just turn it down to add some more vibe. Depends on what your intention is with that part. If it was intended to be kind of the lead instrument in this section, then I would just pan it towards the center. And then the last part that I have for volume balance is, this isn't really volume, but I don't have another section to put it in. So this is actually the clap inside of your bridge. When this clap comes in, it sounds very vanilla, and it sounds very much like a MIDI clap. And so what I would do is I would get whatever microphone you have, doesn't matter what kind of microphone, and just add some actual manual claps to that part, because it's gonna add dynamics, and it's also gonna add that just realness factor to it. And so layer it with the MIDI clap, and you can edit it so it's perfectly on time. By adding a manual clap, it's gonna sound more real, and even just adding two claps, panning them hard right and left, along with the MIDI claps, it's going to do wonders for your mix. More of a production decision, but it impacts your mix. And then overall, I would just add a little bit more saturation or distortion to those claps. It'll thicken them up a little bit and make them just have more impact inside of the mix. Let's dive into the sonic balance. So the first thing that I want to talk about here is adding some more grit to things. This mix is very, very clean, and in some cases, notably your drums, it is too clean. It just sounds really sterile. And so I would want to add some distortion or saturation to my drum bus overall. And you can get pretty aggressive with that. It's going to thicken everything up nicely and make it have more of an impact and presence inside of the song, which again, your drums are lacking on two fronts, both the thickness, actual quality of the drums, but then also their actual volume balance inside of the song as well. So again, bring them up, add some distortion and saturation. You're going to be able to actually push them in the mix higher with some saturation and distortion, because it's going to make them thicker, and then therefore they're also going to be louder, and the actual peak volume compared to average volume is going to be narrowed. So we're actually reducing dynamics. If you don't understand this, it's fine. Just add some distortion. You're going to be able to have more headroom to then boost those drums. The other thing is that I would also add some distortion and or saturation to your bass guitar as well. So if you're using Logic, I would just add this overdrive to it. Probably 3 decibels or something of distortion would probably liven that bass up quite a bit, as well as, and I'd probably do the same thing for your drums. You can get a little bit more aggressive with your drums. If you have some premium plugins, then you can go to for example, the Slate Digital has some really nice saturation plugins. So I would probably reach for this Hollywood preamp. And then you can just crank this saturation knob quite a bit, and that will add a lot of saturation to your mix as well. Again, your drums and your bass are the two things that I wanted on the most, just because they're so sterile, and it'll add just a little bit more character and vibe to those instruments, really liven up the mix overall. Because these are MIDI instruments, or at least a lot of them are, that's going to be one of the most common things that I would do to a MIDI mix, because they're so sterile. Like that, it's just too clean and it has zero vibe when you just listen to the raw elements of most MIDI instruments. So let's move on and talk about the vocals a bit. So I really like the verse vocals. They're nice and warm, and stylistically, I think they fit really well inside of the verse. I do have an issue with the chorus vocals, because when the chorus vocals come in, they sound very, very different than the verse vocals. What happens is they become overly harsh, and it's because of the reverb that you have on the vocals. So let's listen to the chorus here really quick. Listen to how much harsher they are than the verse vocals. Because they are so much harsher, and the reason why they're so much harsher is because of that reverb you have on them. And I would probably do two things. I would probably, on your bus, wherever you have those reverbs, I would take your EQ before or after the reverb, doesn't matter, just cut out the 3K. And then I'd probably do a little bit more high passing and low passing if you haven't done that already, just to kind of separate it a little bit from the actual vocals themselves. So it'll create some separation between the actual reverb and the lead vocal, and smooth it out overall. And then the second thing I would do is add a plate reverb rather than whatever reverb you're using. I'm not sure if you're using a plate already. It doesn't sound like you are. If you are, maybe choose a different plate reverb, because plate reverbs are going to be way more smooth than other types of reverbs, like a room, a hall, or something like that. Just plate reverbs are almost always the go-to reverb for vocal. And then I might actually boost a little bit in the low end on those vocals, because you're going up to a higher register in your voice, or whoever sang it. And so it's automatically going to have less low end. And so if you're just using the same exact EQ as you were during the verses, that can actually create undesirable impacts to the chorus vocals as well. So be cognizant of using the same, just one preset all the way through the song. Unless it's like a punk song that sounds exactly the same the whole way through, you probably need to do some sort of changes or automation throughout the song in order to keep the vibe the way that you want it throughout the entire thing. One more thing on the vocals is I probably would use a little bit more de-essing on your vocals. Overall, the vocals sound pretty good, but I would do a little bit more de-essing, because once this is mastered properly, then it's going to have a little bit more brightness added to the song, and those S's are really going to be popping out and cause some issues inside of the master itself. So that's another thing that I would make sure that you address as well. Be more aggressive than you think you need to on your de-essing, because that is definitely going to. Spatial balance is next. So let's cover the spatial balance. Yeah, so at the very beginning, revisiting this guitar. Anyway, so you have this guitar way over here on the right-hand side, and it's sounding a bit odd because it's a little bit harsher, and so it's poking out of the mix, and it just doesn't sound like it belongs inside of the whole mix. And so I'd probably do two things to fit it in better spatially, and that is add a little bit more warmth. So at the low mids, probably around like 400 or so, between 300 and 400 hertz, I would add a little bit of boost on the EQ. And then I would also add another reverb to the other side. So for example, I'd add a bus. This is going to be your guitar reverb bus. And so I'm going to have a, Space Designer here. I'm going to probably use a spring reverb, whatever reverb you want, doesn't matter. But then before that reverb happens, I'm going to add my utility plugin, and I'm going to swap the left and right. So that will send it right to the opposite side that it currently is. And it's actually going to create a lot more connection between the two sides of your mix. So even though your guitar is panned to the right, it's going to sound a lot more like it belongs in the entire mix, because you hear that sound bouncing off basically the left wall of your mix. That will create some connection and some cohesiveness throughout the mix, and adding that guitar back into it a little bit more. This is just a great way if it just feels too separate, especially if you only have one guitar and you're panning it to the side, then this will create some connection that is really, really critical to ensure that your guitar doesn't sound like it's completely in a different mix right? It doesn't even hardly sound like it's part of this song almost, because it's just too separate. So that's a trick that I would probably use as well to connect that. And the next one is your vocal in your verse. It has this delay on it.
Making it up from time to time.
Some time. And then the time on the left, or right, excuse me, has this other delay. The issue is that the delayed vocal sounds way too similar to your lead vocal. And so I would do several things to try to avoid this situation. And the first thing is just make sure there's more, you're sending that to a reverb that is actually in the back of your mix. So I have several videos on how to create a depth in your mix. So just search it if you haven't, or visit my channel and you can search it. To create depth in your mix, I create 3 different reverb rooms essentially. So one's up front, one's in the middle, one's in the back. And I would always send my reverb or my delays to the back reverb bus to make them feel further away. Other things that I would do is I would add just a top and bottom shelf to it, especially a top, because this is going to be the most critical. This is what's going to make it feel further away, because things that are further away have less high-end energy, and therefore they're going to feel further away once you cut off some of that top end. Additionally, I would probably add either some really aggressive thick type compression or just some distortion. So I often will just add a overdrive, something like this. I can get pretty aggressive with this because it's going to be relatively subtle inside of the mix overall, and it'll thicken up that vocal and then actually make it seem even more further away because it's so thick. And then I might just back it off just a little bit on the mix because it's pretty loud. Additionally, I'd probably delay it a little bit more. It sounds like it's probably a half note or something. I might shoot for a full whole note, or if it's a quarter, I would shoot for a half, because almost taking the place of the lead vocal a little bit too much. And again, it's just distracting me from the lead vocal, and I'm listening to that one instead. And so I might just make it a stereo delay maybe, and just be a little bit more creative with that delay to make it sound separate from the main vocal. I have some other videos on how to create interesting delays too, if you want to look up that one. That one might be also helpful. And the last note on the spatial aspects of the mix is that pan your hi-hat to the left, please. Because it's going to make it sound more like a real kit. The only time that your hi-hat should be in the middle of your mix is if you have no other choice, or if you have a hip-hop mix, and then it's not even a real kit, and it's obvious it's not a real kit, and it's fine to keep your hi-hat in the middle. It's usually the place where we would keep it inside of a hip-hop mix. But for this, it sounds like a real kit, and it's supposed to sound like a real kit. And so I would keep that hi-hat on the left-hand side to make sure that it is where it is from the drummer's perspective, right? The hi-hat is always on the left-hand side. And so make sure that your hi-hat is staying there in the mix, and you pan it just, 20% left. Make your drums feel more real and come to life a little bit more inside of the mix. In this mix overall, there's a lot of things you have just dead center, and the more you can kind of pan those off a little bit, especially with things like the hi-hat that aren't necessary to be in the middle, the more room and space you're going to have inside of your mix overall. The very last section here is dynamics. So the biggest issue that I hear is at the very beginning and then right before the last chorus. So, and this has to do with the drums, right? Because your drums are a bit quiet. I'll give you that. By further emphasizing the drums and creating transition moments inside of the song, you can add way more life to it. So, for example, you have this cool little intro that has all these synths, and then it builds up, and then it just dies. Like these drums are trying to drag that into the song, into that little instrumental part. But what it's doing is that is really just killing all of the energy. So what you should be doing, again, I would do this on the drums. Boost that. You can kind of crossfade that a little bit. But listen to this intro now. All of a sudden it draws that listener in right away to that intro. And by having those really loud drums like doo-doo, doo-doo, all of a sudden now I'm like, ooh, this is like, it's drawing me into that first section. So that's what I would do there. And then also again, very last section, there's this really long drum fill, but if I wasn't listening for it, I would totally miss it. You want that stuff to be front and center because it's different, it's unique, and it's going to capture the listener's attention. Throughout the entire mix, you need to be making stuff, emphasizing the song the best way possible to keep the listener's attention. Listeners have about a 9-second attention span, meaning if you don't have interesting things happening every 9 seconds, your listener is going to get bored and move away. This comes back to, obviously, your songwriting is most critical, your production is second most critical, but then your mix needs to actually utilize the production elements to the nth degree in order to keep your listener's attention. And so by having this extra automation on top of whatever you already have going on, it's going to keep the listener's attention. And if you have, for example, a lead guitar part that then transitions into a vocal, which then there's a fill into the next section of the song, I'm going to boost the guitar a little bit, maybe 2 decibels, and then I'm going to boost the vocal like 1 decibel, or it's probably going to already be loud anyway. And then I'm going to emphasize the fill right after that point into the next section, because that's going to keep the listener's attention of like, oh, I'm focusing on the guitar now. Now I'm focusing on the vocal. Now I'm going to be focusing on the drums. Now I'm going to be focusing on the next section of the song because that's what I'm being drawn towards. All of this automation is really meant to emphasize where the listener should be listening at that very specific point in time of the song. By doing that, then you're making it easy for the listener to enjoy the song, to feel the different elements that are happening, while obviously there's supporting elements, but there's always going to be a main thing going on that you need to draw your listener's attention towards. While you can go way overboard with this, in this song, you're just not doing enough of it. And then overall, I would also emphasize your last chorus a little bit. Just make the whole thing louder. I'll just come in here, bump it up a bit. That's it. Your last chorus should always hit a little bit harder than the rest of the song. So even if it takes, maybe dip this down a little bit, emphasize the last section of the song, everything's going to be awesome. I'm going to link some of the other videos I mentioned inside of the description, as well as my free EQ and compression cheat sheets, so you can get those if you are struggling to figure out how to compress or how to EQ your mix properly. Those guides are invaluable tools to help you get a more professional mix. So with that, thanks for watching, and don't forget to get the guides, and I will see you in the next one.